Okay, so that's what I want to say. If you remember nothing from my talk, I think the civilization state is a good thing to remember. The second point I want to make is the second building block is about China's likely behavior as a global power. Now, we all wonder about this, don't we? We all think, what is it going to be like? Because, you know, in view of the prospect that it will become the dominant country in the world, how is it going to operate? You know? And I think it will operate in a way which is very different from the Western tradition. In particular, the United States and prior to that, Britain. And I think that the steer for this, I think, has to be history. You know, how historically have the Chinese behaved as a major power in their own time, compared with for example, the Western experience. Now, there is a very, very lazy Western way of thinking about, for example, China, about lots of things about to do with China, but in the context of Africa. You know, how many times have you read something which says, you know, China and Africa, the new colonialism? Well, this is so lazy, because actually, unless you include, which you can do, the Chinese expansion under the Qing dynasty from the early mid-17th century onwards, where they expanded into the western regions, which I was describing earlier on. Now, you can argue that was a form of colonialism. I think it would be you can, but it was internal. It was continental expansion. It was not overseas maritime expansion, which was the absolutely classical form of European expansion, especially after the great discoveries and the development of the great colonial empires of the 18th and 19th and first half of the 20th centuries. Now, the Chinese never expanded like that. They never had any colonies. They could have had colonies. I mean, China was far more advanced than its neighbors for a very long period of history. So, for example, the colonization of Southeast Asia would have been for the Chinese during the Ming dynasty with those great ships of Zheng He and so on, an absolute doddle. But they didn't do it. And the reason the Chinese didn't do it was they weren't interested in doing it. And the reason they weren't interested in doing it was because the Chinese felt that as the Middle Kingdom, they were the center of the earth. They were the most advanced civilization. So why would they want to step outside of that civilization into varying degrees of barbarism and so on? No. Whereas this was absolutely the opposite to the Western experience. The Western experience, the Western tradition, of course, we're talking essentially about Europe for many centuries. The European desire was to expand and project its power outside its country, around the world, and to the colonies. The people were obliged to speak, you know, English or French or whatever it was. The language of instruction in schools was always English or French or what have you. The religion that was proselytized was Christianity, and so on. That was a very different way of exercising power. Actually, I think that Europe historically was a very aggressive and expansionist and bellicose force. And we saw this eventually it came to an end with these two huge wars, the First World War and the Second World War, which were essentially the projection on a global scale of the many rivalries and so on that existed in the context of Europe. Well, of course, that's over now because Europe, shattered in 1945, has moved into a different sort, finally into a different sort of era. Now, it is certainly true that while China did not colonize, it did have a system in that part of the world, and that system was called the tributary system, and it embraced, of course, China and Indochina, Laos, Cambodia, all those kind of countries, and Japan and Korea and bits of the archipelago states like part of Java and so on in Southeast Asia. It lasted literally for thousands of years. The tribute states remained independent, but were required by the emperor the Chinese emperor, to present tribute to the emperor from time to time as an expression of the recognition of the superiority of China. Actually, the superiority of China is a very important idea, because if the calling card of Europe was expansion and aggression, the calling card of China was a sort of cultural hierarchy, a notion that the Chinese were, and in some senses still still regard themselves to be superior. And that, I think, introduces a little idea about what might be the most important modes when China, or mode when China becomes the dominant power in the world. Well, actually, this lasted for thousands of years, but in 1900, it finally broke up because China missed out on the Industrial Revolution of the 19th century, which transformed the European countries, in particular Britain and France, and the Japanese got in on the act as well, and militarily they were hugely, of course, modernized compared, because of the Industrial Revolutions, with where China was at, and that was the end of the tributary system. But we need to get to the present, and the present is absolutely fascinating, because this chart here shows you that the rise of China, the transformation of China, has spilt over, if you like, into the region in an extraordinary way. This bar chart here is the proportion of exports going from the various East Asian countries to the Chinese market. If you go back 10 years, most of these markets, for Singapore, for Korea, for Taiwan, for Japan, the biggest market was the United States. No more. No more. The biggest market for virtually all these countries, I think now, bar the Philippines, is China. Easily. Not slightly, easily. What's happening is the East Asia is being, at great speed, profoundly restructured by the rise of China. We are, if you like, returning in one sense to the tributary era. The tributary era was a China-centric system. It was based on the fact that China was far more advanced than other countries in the region. And now we are returning, in a sense, to that situation. So I don't want to go into great detail about this now, because I'm going to return briefly to this subject at the end. But East Asia is being restructured by the rise of China. We are witnessing a process of the creation of a new order in East Asia. Never forget how important East Asia is. East Asia is home to 1/3 of the world's population. It is already the largest economic region in the world. It is larger than North America, and it is larger than Europe. So it really matters what happens. Up until 1900, it was a tributary system. From 1900 to 1950, it was a colonial system. From 1950 to 2000, it was a sort of Westphalian system. It will not be that, in my view, in the first century of the new millennium. It will be something different, and it will be, above all, about China. So my third characteristic of China's difference is something completely different. It's about race. 1.3 billion people. We all know that. China's huge. What I guess most of us probably are not aware of is that over 90% of the Chinese think of themselves as of one race, as Han. Now, this is so different from the other world's most populous nations, which are India, the United States, Indonesia, and Brazil, all of which, in varying degrees, they regard themselves to be multiracial and multicultural, that it's extraordinary. Now, you could say, well, obviously, China, a huge landmass like this, historically, was home to many, many, many different races. And you would be absolutely right. Of course, that was the case. But that's not the interesting question. The interesting question is, why do the Chinese think, more than 9 out of 10 Chinese think that they are of the same race? It's an extraordinary fact. Now, every country has its ethnic process of construction. Australia is a classic example. I mean, you know, European migration and essentially the destruction, large-scale destruction and marginalization of the indigenous people. The United States shares that characteristic, plus, of course, the role of African slavery and so on. And China, Britain had its process and so on. Every country has. And this is very important. It's greatly underestimated, its importance. International relations almost completely neglects it. But this is very, very important. Now, the question is, well, why do the Chinese think like that? What is the reason for it? How did this process happen? Well, let me go back to that Han map. Now, think of China as just the Han dynasty, if you like, that territory. And we can't understand why the Chinese think like this, how this process happened, without once more returning to the question of the civilization state. Because for 2,000 years, China was created in this space, if you like. That's a very, very long period, and all within the same, basically the same kind of polity. And by a very complex process of occupation, of absorption, of assimilation, of government resettlement, of ethnic cleansing, and so on, slowly, but over 2,000 years, the sense of difference that distinguished one from another, different races in this part of China, became increasingly less important to what they seemed to have in common. And what they had in common was, above all, shaped by the importance of this idea of Chinese culture. And the sheer power of Chinese culture, I think, has got to be understood over an even longer historical period. I mean, remember that China was, with the Fertile Crescent, the first home to settled agriculture as opposed to nomadic peoples in the world, roughly 12,000 years ago. And therefore, it was also the site of the first relatively complex communities, the first forms of centralized power, i.e. the creation of the state or government, if you like, in its earliest forms. And it's no accident, I think, given this kind of history, that, you know, Confucius, writing 2,500 years ago at the same time as the Greek philosophers, was producing such sophisticated ideas about governments, about the relationship between leaders and led, about the moral imperatives of leadership, and so on. And then fast forwarding to the kind of period I've been talking about, the last 2,000 years, some extraordinary, innovative and effervescent dynasties. The Tang, then the Song in the 11th, 12th century, probably the most inventive period of China, during which were many of the inventions which were subsequently exported in a sense to Europe and became very important in the Industrial Revolution. And then the Ming and even into the Qing. You know, China has been blessed with not one period in the sun, but from a civilizational point of view, several periods in the sun. And so this has led, I think, to a very powerful sense amongst the Chinese of a shared identity, a shared culture, and a deep pride in that culture. And that is where ideas, essentially, I think, of Chinese superiority come from. In other words, it's very, very deeply rooted in history. So the notion of the Han, if you like, is a sort of ethno-cultural identity. Now, what about its positive and negative aspects? Well, it's clear that the most important positive aspect of the Han identity is that it would be absolutely impossible to hold together a country as large as this in terms of population and geography without the cement of the Han. This would have been absolutely inconceivable. People, if you remember, after Tiananmen Square, they said in 1989, well, obviously China's going to break up just like the Soviet Union did. I mean, this was nonsense. This was arrant nonsense. I mean, the reason the Soviet Union so easily broke up was that less than half the population was Russian. But China, you know, over 90% thought of themselves as the same race. It was not going to break up. It was inconceivable that that was going to happen. What is the weakness The great weakness, I think, of this process of Hanization has been that the Chinese view of other cultures, other ethnicities, is that they too should be Hanized. You know, that, for example, the two most obvious examples in China today are the Tibetans and the Uyghur, who regard themselves certainly as not to be Han and are not seen by the Han as Han, and certainly resist very strongly the idea that they should be Hanized. And this has been a tremendous thorn, I think, ever since 1949. All the problems go back much earlier than that for Chinese government, because they've not succeeded in creating a basis for a successful relationship between the Han and the Uyghur in Xinjiang and the Tibetans in Tibet, and also in some of the neighboring provinces. And I'm going to come to the subject of democracy in a moment, but we sort of, in the West, major on the problem of Chinese democracy. I don't think that is the big problem, actually, in the rise of China. I think much more important is going to be this kind of question, because to some extent, basically, the Chinese project their experience onto the rest of the world, just like the Americans do. I mean, you can't understand the American view of the world and how America's behaved as a great power without taking into account, the destruction of the Amerindians, the African slavery, the sense of manifest destiny, the notion of the frontier spirit, the universalism as expressed in the Constitution, and so on. So what countries that become great powers project their historical experience onto the world and see the world in those terms. And I think the Chinese are likely to do that in relationship to their experience of the process of ethnic construction. So, for example, India and China are chalk and cheese as countries. They are so different. In every sense, they are so different. And I don't think either understands each other very well at all. In fact, I don't think the Chinese really understands the Indians, because the Indians it is so diverse compared with the Chinese experience. My last point in the context of building blocks concerns something that in the West we think we've got absolutely taped about the Chinese. We think that we know absolutely that the great weakness and vulnerability of China is the lack of legitimacy of the state. That is the Achilles heel of China. We see it retailed day in, day out on our media, in public discourse, and so on. The problem with China is the lack of democracy. The problem with China is the lack of human rights, and so on. Well, I want to disabuse you of this way of thinking. I don't think it's like this, and I want to try and explain why. We think that the fundamental, maybe the exclusive source of the legitimacy of a state, the authority of a state, is democracy. I think that's where Western opinion is these days. And you've got to square that with the fact that I want to argue that the Chinese state enjoys more legitimacy in the eyes of the Chinese than any Western state enjoys amongst its population, even though clearly it's not democratic. These are some figures compiled by Tony Seish at Harvard and the Kennedy School, are based on 4 surveys he conducted in his field research over a period of those years there. The left-hand blue line is the level of satisfaction with central government, and then it sort of goes down, down to the township village as the purple line. And what is extraordinary about these figures is the sheer levels of satisfaction. I mean, it is inconceivable that any Western state anywhere could command figures of over 80% or now over 90% levels of satisfaction with central government. So, if this is the case, then how do we explain it? Because clearly, the reason for this level of legitimacy and acceptance is not democracy as we know it. Well, back to the civilization state. The Chinese don't see their state institutions in the same terms as we see ours in the West. They think that the primary role of government or the state is as the embodiment, the protector, the guardian, the defender of Chinese civilization. The maintenance of the unity of Chinese civilization. In the eyes of the Chinese, nothing could be more important. I'll tell you now that if serious divisions opened up in China today, and there was a serious threat to the unity of the People's Republic, then this government would fall. Or, to put it in the old terms of Mencius, the mandate of heaven would be withdrawn. That is how critical this question is. So the whole way in which legitimacy and the whole way in which the state works in China is completely different from the way it works in the West. The relationship between society and the state has been constructed in a very different way. So the attitude towards the state amongst the people is very different. In the West, depending, of course, partly on where you are on the political spectrum, what do we think about the state? We think it's necessary, unless you're in the Tea Party or something like that, and it's well extreme on the right, and the American right. We think that the state is necessary, but its powers need to be constrained. There are limits to what we regard as acceptable involvement of the state. And we want those clearly regulated and codified in law and so on. Now, the Chinese have a completely different attitude. The Chinese attitude towards the state is not as a stranger or an alien or an enemy or anything like that. It is as not a friend, as an intimate. Not any old intimate, but actually as a member of the family. Not any old member of the family, but the head of the family. Remember, the family with the state are the two most important institutions in Chinese society. Now, this is so different from the Western mentality to be, chalk and cheese. We couldn't be like them, they couldn't be like us. That doesn't mean we can't learn things from each other. We will. We will have to. That will become increasingly important. But they are so different for profound historical reasons. And I want to suggest to you, actually, that the Chinese state, far from being the source of weakness of China, is actually probably its greatest strength. It is a remarkable institution. It has presided in the last 30 years, over the most remarkable historical transformation in human history. That requires an extremely competent state. And I think what actually will happen as the West begins to take China seriously and think of China as it is, in its own terms rather than in Western terms, then we will be puzzled and perplexed and stimulated and curious in a way we are not now about the Chinese state. Because the Chinese state is set in a different paradigm to our Western history and our Western experience. The Chinese paradigm combines two things which we've not seen combined in this way: an extraordinary, competent, and ubiquitous state, combined with, except a brief period, namely the Mao period, a ferocious commitment to a ferocious market. We've never seen this before. And we, I can assure you, are going to spend a lot of time over the next few decades and longer in trying to understand this phenomenon and work out how it works. Now, at the moment, our interest in the West in terms of the state is only about democracy. We only ever talk about democracy. We never talk about the competence of the state. We have lost that ability to talk about state competence. Now, the Chinese don't talk about that side of it. They talk about the competence of the state. This is a very old Confucian tradition. It's not simply a communist tradition. This is a very old Confucian tradition. And what I'm arguing is the Chinese state is supremely competent. You compare the Indian state and the Chinese state, and we often, for understandable reasons, celebrate the Indian state because it's a function of democracy. The problem is the Indian state doesn't work. It is deeply corrupt, much worse than China, and it just doesn't function in any meaningful way. Whereas the Chinese state is brilliant in terms of its competence, given that it's a developed.